give my local council on how we can make sure that future projected house building levels reflect these very special circumstances in my constituency.
Well, Mr Speaker, I commend my right honourable friend and her council for all the sterling work they've done to build the homes in Basingstoke that people need. I would say to her, the important thing is to make sure that your local plan is up to date and that you agree with the Planning Inspectorate a sound plan based upon the constraints that you have to get the right number of houses that you need. And I'm very happy to work with her to make sure that that is so.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State cannot fail to notice that during this session, the number of questions which have centred around the White Paper. Councils around the UK want to know what's the timetable, what's the criteria, when will it be published. Inverclyde want to apply for this levelling up funding. Can you help me? And do you want to come and visit Greenock? I can show you the projects.
I've spent many happy hours in Greenock, and I'm looking forward to spending many more. I imagine that time there can only be enhanced, whether in Capulo or anywhere else, with the honourable gentleman. But the key thing about the Levelling Up Fund is that constituencies across the United Kingdom, including in Scotland, have benefited, and I look forward to working with him and others in order to ensure that there are even. As a Morton fan, he will appreciate that patience is a virtue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The forthcoming Levelling Up White Paper is an opportunity to undo the imbalance in investment in active travel networks between towns and urban areas which get a lot and villages which get very little to connect them. So will my right honourable friend arrange for a meeting with me and one of his ministers, together with members of Potton Town Council and Sandy Town Council, to talk about their active travel network?
Yep.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that Warwickshire County Council is keen to have some sort of county unitary deal. But he'll also be aware that Warwickshire District and Stratford District Councils recently voted for a combined council, and with the intent of a unitary as well. Should it not be down to not the councillors themselves or the Secretary of State, but the public who decide the future of local government across our country?
Well, I welcome the moves across Warwickshire to consider how services can be delivered even more efficiently as part of the economic success story that is the Greater West Midlands. And in particular, can I commend the leadership of Izzy Seckham, the leader of Warwickshire County Council. And I think that the fact that she and her group continue to be re-elected with ever greater levels of support indicates that she is in a strong position to help bring people together across the constituency.
Final question, Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Volunteers who serve on our parish councils do an amazing job, and in rural communities such as mine there are significant challenges to attending meetings like transport, adverse weather, work and caring responsibilities. Now, in the pandemic, we've seen that virtual and hybrid format works well. Will the Secretary of State look to allowing parish councils to sit in virtual or hybrid format moving forward to increase and widen access and help them work to the best of their ability?
Well, I think were it not for the case that during the pandemic we had not allowed councils to meet virtually, not only would we have impaired the effective working of local government, we would never have known about Jackie Weaver, and the country would have been the poorer for it. Can I just commend the work of parish councillors and others and say I am strongly in sympathy with the view that hybrid meetings should continue in order to ensure the maximum amount of efficiency. I think there is a case for saying that there are certain significant local authority meetings that should occur with all councillors present, but what I want to is to proceed by the maximum amount of consensus in order to reflect the maximum level of efficiency and in particular sensitivity to those who serve in constituencies like my honourable friends, where the rurality and the dispersed nature of representation is important.
Thank you. We now come to the urgent question. I'll just let people leave and then. All right, good to see you. Okay. We got the. Hi, you're all right. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for the other day. Thank you. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Leila Moran.
to ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development to make a statement on the eruption of the Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai volcano and subsequent tsunami in Tonga.
Mr Speaker, I'm saddened and shocked by the situation in Tonga, and my thoughts are with all those caught up in the appalling devastation caused by the volcanic eruption tsunami. My thoughts are also with the family of a British woman, Angela Glover, who died following the tsunami. We are supporting her family and are in contact with the local authorities. On the 15th of January, a series of eruptions from the Tonga Hunga Ha'apai underwater volcano were heard and felt across Tonga. Shortly afterwards, a tsunami hit the islands, including the main island of Tonga Tapu and the capital Nuku'alofa. There were reports of waves between 5 and 10 metres, and the eruption caused waves as far away as Peru. The explosions have left Tonga covered in a layer of thick volcanic ash. New Zealand and Australian Defence Forces conducted surveillance flights, which reported catastrophic damage on Atata Island, Mango Island and Nineveh Island. Full details of the humanitarian impact are still unknown, but there are estimates that up to 80,000 people will have been affected. The UK is providing vital humanitarian support. Working closely with our Australian and New Zealand partners, we've provided 17 pallets of supplies. These include 90 family tents, 8 community tents and wheelbarrows. These have been specifically requested by the Tongan government, and this support is en route to Tonga on Australia's HMAS Adelaide, which is expected to arrive the day after tomorrow. The Royal Navy ship HMS Spey should arrive in Tonga on the 25th of January. Supplies to be delivered by HMS Spey will include bottled water, sets of PPE and first aid kits, and we're also looking at further support. The International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, DREF, has released £345,000 to the Red Cross Society of Tonga to support their response to assist community affected, and the UK is a very significant donor to the DREF. More generally, since 2015, Tonga has received over £25 million of UK aid through our core funding to multilateral institutions. And the UN is deploying a crisis expert to coordinate the response, and the UK is funding this deployment.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for granting me this urgent question. Now, Mr Speaker, the Tongan government has called the eruption an unprecedented disaster. A volcanic blast visible from space, more powerful than an atomic bomb, with 85% of Tongans affected. And not just from the eruption itself, but the ash, which now poses a threat to drinking supplies and to public health, and also from the tsunami, which swept away their homes and washed Lisala Folau out to sea. When I was in the water, I remember going under 8 times, he said. My legs are disabled and don't function well. He clung to a log for 27 hours and miraculously he survived. Now, Mr Speaker, Tonga may be a long way away, but it is a Commonwealth partner, an ally and long-standing friend. The Tongan High Commissioner has asked me to convey their thanks to the British people for their support. But while I've heard what the Minister said, she will know that none of the money going there is new. Why have we not promised any new bilateral aid for Tonga, given that we have not given them a penny this year? Does the Minister regret the decision to cut aid to our Commonwealth partners more generally by £500 million? And does she accept that the aid cut has left us responding to disasters like this with one hand tied behind our backs? Under our presidency, Mr Speaker, of COP26, attention was rightly given to the vulnerability of small island developing states like Tonga. Does the Minister not agree that unless we help Tonga fully recover from this crisis, then it will struggle to put the necessary mitigations in place for the even greater climate crisis? Can the Minister answer the following questions also? What conversations has she personally had with Tongan counterparts? She mentioned supporting one family, but are there other UK nationals needing support in Tonga? Can the Minister clarify the role of HMS Spey in further operations, especially given Tonga's zero COVID approach? And finally, I note the drift and delay in the government's response to the crisis. It took nearly a week for any kind of an announcement by press release, I tabled name day questions which were due last Friday. I've yet to hear back. Is this indicative of what happens when you relegate development from its seat at the cabinet table?
Yeah.
Mr Speaker, Tonga and the UK have very deep historical ties and are both Commonwealth members. It's a low-lying and extremely vulnerable state to climate change impacts, as the Honourable Member points out, and to natural disasters. And we are working together with other Commonwealth members, including Fiji, New Zealand and Australia, to support Tonga as it recovers from this damage. And it's absolutely right that we should be working hand in hand with our partners. She asked a question about communications. The connectivity, as she knows, has been affected throughout Tonga, including the underseas cable. And repairs to that cable are due to start towards the end of this week, but it will take, I'm told, up to 2 weeks to restore that. In the meantime, the satellite telecommunications have been absolutely invaluable. Our High Commissioner, as you will be aware, our High Commission reopened there just last year, but our High Commissioner has been helping to use her satellite phone not only to communicate with the crisis centre in Wellington, but also to give that phone support to British nationals. In terms of our ongoing support, right now, equipment, these 17 pallets is on, which is what the Tongan government themselves have asked for, and HMS Spey is on its way to arrive shortly with, as I said, water and urgent health supplies, for example. I can't comment any further because we're continuing to monitor the situation and work with partners to assess the full need, which is also actually why the UN crisis management is so important, and that is what we are funding.
Mark Paulson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and nobody could fail to be moved by the pictures of the devastation in Tonga as a consequence of the tsunami. But there are some good links between Tonga and us here, not least some of the fantastic rugby players, Tongan rugby players who are playing here, including Melekai Feketoa, who has set up a relief fund that's already raised $50,000. Now, Melekai plays for the Wasps in Warwickshire, and the club have said they'll be donating 20% of their ticket revenues from their match this coming weekend. So will the Minister join me in applauding the rugby community for coming together, supporting Tonga in a way that it would always would do?
Can I absolutely pay tribute to the rugby players for all they're doing to raise funding for this urgent situation, and wish the Warwickshire Wasps very well in all their matches. I don't know how they intend for the money that they're raising to be distributed, but I would be more than happily make contact with my honourable friends and perhaps put them in touch with the DREF so we can make sure that it gets to those who need it on the ground.
Catherine West, the Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And like many, we've been shocked on this side of the House by the seen and personal stories coming from Tonga. And with communications difficult, I fear that there is still bad news to come. I know the whole House will join with me in expressing our complete solidarity with the people of Tonga and in passing on our condolences to those who have lost loved ones in the tsunami and volcanic eruption. Tonga and the UK have deep and abiding relationships, and I understand that it is actually at Coventry that the Wasps play, but let's leave that one there. And indeed that it's not just across education, culture and armed services, but indeed across both codes of rugby, including Rugby League, which I know that Mr Speaker will appreciate. So it's not just the union which has the civic society reach, but it's fantastic to hear that clubs are joining together across civic society to help out with the crowdfunding for this terrible disaster. It's right that the UK steps up to the plate to offer support, and I wanted actually to commend the High Commission for the work already undertaken to support the people of Tonga, and also working closely with the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces to speedily deliver aid. It's so important in the Pacific that things are done with speed. And that this support will clearly need to be maintained and to ensure that Tonga can rebuild and recover in the short to medium term. And given our close links, we should continue to do so, not just a knee-jerk reaction now, but that should be sustained. I have 4 asks of the Minister. Which additional assets, if any, are being deployed to Tonga or under consideration once the Spey effort has concluded? Secondly, could I press her on the point made earlier by the member for Abingdon around the need for rebuilding in the context of the background of cuts in development aid. What's the medium to long-term strategy for this region? What conversations she has had with regional partners to ensure the coordination and sustained approach? And finally, what specific assessments been made of the impact that the eruption and tsunami will have on the COVID efforts specifically, and how the UK can assist in health protection? These are difficult days for the people of Tonga, and our response in the House has the potential to be of great relief and comfort to them in their hour of need. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I absolutely recognise the Rugby League contribution in Tonga. In fact, I have very fond memories of attending an international rugby league tournament in Hawaii in the 1990s, where I first saw the Tongans play. But back to more serious matters. As well as HMS Spey that is arriving in Tonga on the 25th of January, we are looking at further support. And the deployment of the UN crisis expert will help coordinate that response, which is why we are funding that response. In terms of ODA budgets, we did maintain our rapid response capabilities in close coordination with the Australian government, and that means the support we're providing is tailored to the needs of those affected. Since 2015, Tonga's received over 26.9 million of aid, as I mentioned, through multilateral organisations. That includes the World Bank, the Asian Development and others. And indeed, I think it's over 300 million of aid that has been provided to, this, to other similar Pacific Island states.
Richard Graham.
In referring to the contribution from my honourable friend for rugby, can we go one step further, Minister, and consider whether, for example, Six Nations rugby games, could they hold a special collection for Tonga, which would then be match funded by the British government, so that everyone would have the chance to contribute in a sport to which Tonga has contributed so much themselves, and the government can play its part as well?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd be more than happy to discuss with my honourable friend how rugby fans could help the people of Tonga.
And next year we've got the Rugby League World Cup, which Tonga was meant to be playing in, so we need to get in what sport we can. Let's go to shadow spokesperson, or the spokesperson of the SNP, Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd congratulate the honourable member for securing this important debate today. The House really is, I think, united in our sadness for the people of Tonga, and we do want to see what we can do to help and assist the efforts that have already been outlined today. I'm very struck as well by the suggestion about the Six Nations having a contribution or some sort of fundraiser. I'd hope the SRU would be very strongly behind that and assist the Tongans at their time of need. And I do acknowledge what the Minister has outlined in terms of the aid that has been requested and is on its way to Tonga. But I have to make the point that we really must reassess the cuts that have been made, particularly to the Emergency Disaster Relief Fund, from 500 million to 34.5 million. We cannot do more with less. And what we have seen under this administration has been a deliberate, willful cutting of capacity to deal with climate change, international development, and indeed emergency responses. So I really would urge that we continue a long-term engagement with Tonga, but also the wider world, and get these budgets back up to the levels they need to be for the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Mr Speaker, we remain a world leader in international development. In 2020, we were the world's third largest donor. And quite rightly, we've been looking at how that aid is best used, which is why during COP and in the run-up to COP, we announced that more of our funding from the UK would be going towards international climate change. And that is particularly important for supporting the small island developing states on their adaptation and resilience programme. And it's also why it is so important that we've worked towards that delivery of the $100 billion climate finance goal. In Glasgow, we also announced the global goal on adaptation and the Glasgow Dialogue on loss and damage, and that will help better coordinate financial support for extreme impacts such as this. We are leading in this area through our work on climate change, through COP, and through our ODA.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very reassured by what the government is doing in sending aid to Tonga. Tonga is one of the longest-serving members of the Commonwealth and a real friend of the UK. The islands are largely COVID-free. There are some concerns that aid workers are isolating on arrival, food is being quarantined, and that is delaying somewhat of the relief operation. Can I ask my right honourable friend what discussions that she has had on urgently speeding up this process so the people of Tonga can be helped as fast as possible?
Mr Speaker, I think it's an excellent question. COVID-19 has had little effect on Tonga directly because due to strict border controls they've had no cases in the community. They did have one case in quarantine on the 27th of October, but it was contained. However, those border closures have deeply affected the tourism industry and impacted the economy. And of course, this will be something for ongoing discussions between Tonga and those who are seeking to support with the humanitarian aid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's all well and good to talk about how much money is being given to Tonga, whether in aid or through climate adaptation finance. But the fact is Tonga is expected to pay over $18.5 million in debt repayments this year, a lot of it to China. And the IMF puts Tonga at high risk of debt distress. In my capacity as chair of the all-party group on small island developing states, I met with the Jubilee Debt Campaign earlier today to talk about how SIDS struggle to access comprehensive debt relief. The existing G20 schemes fall well short of helping them. What can the Minister do to ensure that we're not giving to Tonga with one hand and taking away with the other?
Mr Speaker, the honourable member quite rightly raises the impact of Chinese debt, and China is increasingly seeking long-term strategic influence in Pacific Island countries. As the Foreign Secretary stated last week, Russia and China are working together more and more to assert their dominance over the Western Pacific. It's estimated that no less than 44 low to middle income countries have debts to Beijing in excess of 10% of their GDP. And the UK is working and will continue to work with international partners, including to help countries avoiding having their balance sheets loaded with debt that they cannot afford.
No problem. Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her statement, and can I echo the words from across the Chamber of our solidarity and support for the people of Tonga, and welcoming that we are working very closely with our close allies in Australia and New Zealand to support the people of Tonga. And I very much welcome the Minister's statement that the UK is redeploying military assets to provide humanitarian support for Tonga. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this really does show the importance and strength of the Commonwealth, that we pull together and really help out when partners are in need?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The Commonwealth is an incredibly important partnership. In fact, the Foreign Secretary has just been in Australia only last week. And in this instance, there's been great support from Australia, from New Zealand, from the Fijian authorities who are intending to send a cargo vessel which will go with items that the Tongan authorities have themselves requested. That's expected to arrive on the 28th of this month.
Chick Ready.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can the Minister possibly claim that the UK is leading in this kind of response when the severity and frequency of natural and climate disasters is only increasing, and yet the UK budget for response is falling significantly and dramatically? And can she confirm whether or not the costs of HMS Spey mission will also be counted, double counted you might say, towards the NATO target of 2% of military spending?
Mr Speaker, I think we should be praising our Royal Navy for their very, very swift action. And the fact that HMS Spey is due to arrive there the day after tomorrow, I think is remarkable. We should be really deeply grateful to members of the Royal Navy and all they do to support people in trouble across the globe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tonga is a very long-standing friend and partner to the UK, not least through its membership of the Commonwealth, which it shares with us. And the UK has a long and proud tradition in disaster relief. So can my right honourable friend confirm that those involved in delivering relief, including our excellent Royal Navy, are working to deliver it as quickly as possible?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend asked a very good question. We are endeavouring to deliver it as quickly as possible, but also endeavouring to deliver the supplies that the Tongans themselves are identifying that they need. And that will be what will be happening with these first pallets due to arrive day after tomorrow, and then with HMS Spey when she arrives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My heart goes out to the Tongan people because many of us were saddened by the shocking scenes and the devastation wrought about by the eruption of the Hunga Hapai volcano and the ensuing tsunami. Our international development budget cuts and the cuts to the emergency and disaster relief are widely documented and lamented upon by the poorest communities around the world. But will the Minister ensure that we give the maximum possible support to our friends in Tonga and that support is actually sustained into the medium to long term and it doesn't cease immediately after the current crisis has ended?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we remain one of the largest, in fact the third largest donors of international development aid in the world. We are giving the support to the Tongan people that they're requesting at the moment, and I think it's absolutely right that right now we focus on the emergent needs. Sadly, we know that full recovery from incidents like this can take some time, but that is why we're working with the UN, but also with our friends in Australia, New Zealand, and others in the region. Thank you.
Luke Potter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tsunami and the effects of the volcano eruption brought back painful memories for many of us who lost friends and relatives in the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. So we know what pain that many are suffering. We wish Commander Proudman and his crew on HMS Spey the very best for their mission there. But can the Minister look seriously at the long-term consequences of this? The UN estimates that 60 to 70% of livestock-earning households have seen animals perish on the islands, and the agricultural sector in Tonga accounts for 65% of the country's exports. So when the Minister's looking at what medium and long-term support we can offer, can we also include ensuring that some of the poorest farmers in the world and some of those poorest farmers in Tonga are getting the support they need to get back on their feet?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, in addition to the immediate needs, we're also looking at further support. But I would like to point out that we do give significant funding to Tonga and other Pacific Island countries. We tend to do that through our core funding to multilateral organisations, including World Bank, Green Climate Fund and the Asia Development Banks. And indeed, we estimate that since 2015, the Pacific Island countries have received more than £357 million of UK funding through those organisations. And it's often best to work with partners through that type of organisation to make sure that the best long-term support is given.
We're now coming to the statement. Can I call the Secretary of State for Transport?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement about international travel. It's less than 2 months since the first cases of Omicron were confirmed in the UK, the most infectious variant to emerge since the start of the pandemic. But thanks once again to the nationwide army of medical staff and volunteers and the huge public response to the booster programme, today, with over 137 million jabs administered, including nearly 37 million boosters, Britain is now one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, and Omicron is in retreat. And thanks to the decisions that were taken by the Prime Minister, we've managed to turn the tide on the virus in remarkable time, whilst keeping our domestic society one of the most open in the world. Today, I can confirm to the House, Mr. Speaker, that our international travel regime will also now be liberalised as part of our efforts to ensure that 2022 is the year in which restrictions on travel, on lockdowns and limits on people's lives are firmly placed in the past. Mr. Speaker, from 4 a.m. on the 11th of February and in time for the half-term break, eligible fully vaccinated passengers arriving in the UK will no longer have to take a post-arrival lateral flow test. And that means that after months of pre-departure testing, post-arrival testing, self-isolation, additional expense, all that fully vaccinated people will now have to do when they travel to the UK is to verify their status via a passenger locator form. And Mr. Speaker, we promised we wouldn't keep these measures in place a day longer than was necessary. And it's obvious to me now that border testing for vaccinated travellers has outlived its usefulness, and we're therefore scrapping all travel tests for vaccinated people. not only making travel much easier, but also, of course, saving about £100 per family on visits abroad, providing certainty to passengers, to carriers and vital tourism sector for the spring and the summer seasons. And so, Mr. Speaker, let me explain to the House how this will actually work in practice. For now, we'll maintain our current definition of fully vaccinated for the purposes of inbound travel to the UK. And that means 2 doses of an approved vaccination or 1 dose of a Janssen vaccine. And we'll go further. The measures for those arriving in the UK who do not qualify as fully vaccinated have not changed since last March. So the time has come to review that position too. And today I can announce that passengers who do not qualify as fully vaccinated will no longer be required to do a day 8 test after arrival or indeed to self-isolate. They will still need to fill out a passenger locator form to demonstrate proof of a negative COVID test taken 2 days before they travel, and they must still take a post-arrival PCR test. This is a proportionate system that moves us a step closer to normality while maintaining vital public health protections. Now, for kids travelling to the UK, under 18s will continue to be treated as eligible, fully vaccinated passengers, which means they will not face any tests at the UK border. And today, I'm pleased to confirm that from February the 3rd, 12 to 15-year-old in England will be able to prove their vaccination status via the digital NHS pass for international outbound travel. Again, this should help families plan holidays for February half-term. And Mr. Speaker, reconnecting with key markets, not only to boost the UK economy, but will also help hard-hit aviation sector to take back to the skies. So I can also confirm that from 4 a.m. on the 11th of February, we'll recognise at the UK border vaccine certificates from 16 further nations, and that will include countries like China and Mexico, bringing the vaccine recognition total to over 180 countries and territories worldwide. Mr. Speaker, one of the consequences of COVID and a rapidly changing infection patterns across the world has been the border regime that, while necessary, has at times been complex and confusing and very difficult to navigate. I know that it's been something of a challenge for many people who have been travelling over the last 2 years. So we're also going to simplify the passenger locator form, making it quicker and easier to complete. And from the end of February, we'll also make it more convenient by giving people an extra day to fill out the form before they travel. And whilst the option for a red list of countries will remain in place to provide a first line of defence against future COVID variants of concern arriving from other countries, we are looking to replace the managed quarantine system with other contingency measures, including home isolation, provided we can develop new ways to ensure high levels of compliance. In the meantime, our contingency measures remain available, and as the House knows, there are no countries on the red list currently. But I must make clear, they are only likely to be used, these contingency measures will only be applied if we are particularly concerned about a variant of concern that poses a substantial risk, one which is even greater than Omicron, in other words. Now, the UK Health Security Agency will continue to monitor threats and will maintain a high, effective surveillance capacity, monitoring COVID infections overseas. But I can announce today that over time, we intend to move away from blanket border measures to a more sophisticated and targeted global surveillance system. I'm also committing today to develop a full toolbox of contingency options to provide more certainty on how we respond against future variants. The government will set out our strategy, including how we'll deal with any new and future new strains of the virus next month, and we'll continue to work with international partners, including the World Health Organization, to help all countries achieve a level of genomic sequencing to monitor variants which is much closer to our own world-leading capacity. Mr. Speaker, we're moving into a new phase of the fight against COVID. Instead of protecting the UK from a pandemic, our future depends on us living with endemic COVID, just as we live with flu, for example. So we'll set out our strategy for that transition this spring, But as we navigate our recovery and as we return to more normal travel next month, our advice to all eligible adults who have not been vaccinated stays the same. Please get jabbed as soon as possible. And if you've had 2 jabs, please get boosted. Now, I've been speaking, Mr. Speaker, to a lot of my opposite numbers around the world recently, and they've made clear to me that regardless of what we do, they are very likely to require the booster jab by this summer. And so my advice to anyone who wishes to travel this year, including during the summer, is don't leave it too late to get your booster. You're very likely to be required it by the third country that you're flying to. Mr. Speaker, we already have one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, with the result being that our GDP has outpaced that of other G7 countries. With these changes today, we've one of the most open travel sectors in the world. Of course, we know that COVID can spring surprises, but everybody now should feel confident about booking holidays, business trips and visits to family and friends abroad. But be in no doubt, Mr. Speaker, it's only because the government got the big calls right on vaccination, on boosters, on dealing with Omicron. And we can now open travel and declare that Britain is open for business. Today, we are setting Britain free, Mr. Speaker, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Louise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of today's statement. Mr. Speaker, the aviation industry is a critical part of the UK economy, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs across the UK. But both the haphazard approach and the refusal of the government to grant sector-specific support has caused it real damage. The UK's aviation sector has experienced a slower recovery than any of our European counterparts and has experienced over 60,000 job losses by summer last year. And it is baffling that the government did not do more to support this as a strategic sector and potentially attach conditions for transition to net zero, as countries like France and Germany have done. Too often, the government's indecisive and chaotic approach to each wave of COVID infections has failed to keep the country safe, while causing uncertainty for the travelling public and for business. Each time a new variant has emerged, the government has taken a different approach to border controls and restrictions. We all want to see safe international travel and the protection of public health, and that's precisely why the public finally deserve to hear in full how ministers intend to develop a comprehensive, easily understandable plan to ensure that can happen in the months ahead. We must avoid the sheer absurdity of the Secretary of State announcing one set of restrictions before promptly scrapping that and announcing a completely different regime. Businesses and the public should have clarity about what changes the government will likely make in the event of a new variant, not have to wait until 5 p.m. on a Saturday night for new measures that are required on a Monday morning. That is why it's welcome the government will finally produce a plan to allow the travel industry and the public the certainty they need. And why we have recently outlined our plan on the action needed to learn to live well with COVID and protect lives, livelihoods and help avoid harsh restrictions in future waves. That is critical when it comes to the travel industry. It is, as the Secretary of State has said, inevitable another variant of concern will emerge. With Omicron, the plan the government had produced was upended, proving it was simply not fit for purpose. The government must learn these lessons and outline a framework to guide future decision-making and detect future variants. So when the Secretary of State publishes his plan, will he include the data which will guide the approach to future variants and detail the economic, well-being and equality impact of each scenario? And given the Health Secretary said only last week that testing will remain part of our walls of surveillance, does he agree we should build up the UK's sovereign capability to ensure we always have a supply of tests when we need them? And has he considered the merits of a surveillance system to detect possible future variants? Last month, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State confirmed to me he would raise mine and the CMA's concerns around the PCR market with the Health Secretary. Can he update the House on what progress he has made on cleaning up that market for future travellers? Mr Speaker, and I'd be grateful if the Secretary of State could confirm if the passenger locator form will be available in other languages in the future. Mr Speaker, today's announcement is also a visible reminder of another stark truth, that in an era of global international travel, no one is safe until everyone is safe. In the UK, we have learned that lesson the hard way. If we are going to break this endless cycle of new variants, we have to vaccinate the world. Yet ministers simply haven't met the commitments that were made this summer at the G7 to get the vaccine rolled out to other parts of the globe, and instead cut the overseas aid budget. So can the Secretary of State outline what steps his government is taking to deliver on those measures committed to at the G7? Mr Speaker, living with COVID cannot just be an empty slogan with no plan. That's why we need to properly prepare and protect our lives and livelihoods in the future. It's time ministers finally gave passengers, industry and communities the security and stability they deserve.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, thanks very much to the Honourable Lady for welcoming, I think, the statement today. I understand that she hasn't been in the post very long, but she'll be aware that her predecessors have simultaneously both called for us to tighten up and close the borders whilst simultaneously relaxing and opening them, and often on the same day or a few days apart from each other. But I understand that she's recently come to the post, but there is something that she can do current day, and that is, if she doesn't mind me suggesting, that she may be able to speak to her Welsh Labour governmental counterparts who are a constant drag on opening up aviation, and I hear that she's very keen that we do move ahead with this plan today. I hope she'll be able to assist in persuading them to always move a little bit more promptly. She quite rightly says that we need to have a toolbox in order to respond. And as explained mentioned in the statement, she's absolutely right about that. I do think that we need a toolbox going forward. I don't think it's just a question for the UK. I was talking to the Chief Executive of the UK Health Security Agency this morning, who herself sits and co-chairs a World Health Organization body which is working exactly on this global response. And I think one of the most important things which may have been missed during my statement is just to stress that we believe the time is right to move from individuals being checked as they come over our border, as we know that whatever the variant eventually it gets in, and every country has found that, to a global system of surveillance, which is, if you like, every bit as good as we have here in the UK, where world leading is applied often, but we genuinely have a world leading version of surveillance through the amount of coronavirus testing that we can do with genome sequencing, and we're helping other countries in the world through practical application to catch up with that as well. She asks about what the government is doing to honour our bid made at the G7 and elsewhere with coronavirus. And I just want to sort of gently point out and mention to the House, in developing AstraZeneca, Oxford developed a vaccine which has been used in more arms than any other vaccine in the world. I think I'm right in saying the figure's about 2.5 billion people who've been vaccinated with that. And that is a huge contribution in addition to all of the COVAX and other donations that we've made, and we will continue to do so. Mr Speaker, I think I'm pleased to hear that the whole House is welcoming this particular plan today to unlock and to set Britain free.
We go to the Church Select Committee. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Not only is this announcement today another example of us living with COVID, it's also a landmark day for international travel, a sector that has been absolutely decimated over the last couple of years. And with this news, this surely is the evidence they need that people should now feel confident to book with certainty. Can I ask the Secretary of State, with that in mind, to ensure that there is a culture across Whitehall that if there are bumps in the road, that international travel is not the sector that has to be made an example of, and that we will continue to support international travel and all those fantastic people who work within it?
State.
So I think that my honourable friend's absolutely right about this. As we've learnt more about this pandemic, as it becomes endemic, it's of course quite right that our response should be different. And I mentioned a moment ago about shifting from individual testing at the border to a global system of testing. So I do give him that commitment. We're looking to now work within a new toolbox which will help to set out a framework. We will always act quickly, of course, if we have to, but I believe the days of having to go back to these big kind of lockdowns at the borders are past.
We come to SNP spokesperson Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Once again, Mr Speaker, we have an announcement on coronavirus restrictions being made to the press before being made to Parliament. So while the Government, and in particular this Secretary of State, desperately try to save the Prime Minister's skin with announcements such as this, or the removal of Plan B restrictions generally, Parliament is repeatedly cut out of the loop as the Government throw out policies to placate their base. But we have reached the Omicron peak a little earlier than projected. Indeed, today in Scotland, nightclubs can reopen while the caps on indoor events, table service requirements for venues selling alcohol and social distancing are removed also. But as I heard the Secretary acknowledge, these revised requirements will apply to England only. So can I first ask what discussions he's had with colleagues in devolved administrations about the measures in his statement today, and how those discussions have factored into his decision? In previous changes to travel regs, the devolved administrations were consulted very late and not given adequate time to look over the data and announce a decision simultaneously. And while he proposes to remove the requirement to test on arrival, he will also surely accept that regular lateral flow testing is still imperative in terms of identifying and tracing cases more generally and allowing everyone to travel safely. So what representations has he made to his colleagues in ensuring LFTs remain free on request for everyone, regardless of income? And can you tell us a bit more? It's been asked about, and I don't think he asked about it. What mechanism of monitoring possible new variants will be put in place now that the testing is no longer in place itself? And lastly, Mr Speaker, the aviation industry is still in the same position when it comes to the sector-specific support promised by this government nearly 2 years ago. The impact of COVID on travelling patterns and customer behaviour won't end with this statement today. So what plan does he have to fulfil the promises made to the sector at the start of the pandemic for real targeted government support? The job retention scheme wasn't enough for 3,000 people in my constituency who lost their jobs, Mr Speaker. All those who faced fire and rehire by companies such as Menzies Aviation and British Airways.
Mr Speaker,